I think a lot of you probably have experience in this area. I've just put up the slide contents, but I'd like your input in this area on what we do know and what questions we might need to know in the networking area that you've had about cybersecurity or about cyber transactions or anything in general, or what we have on your networks that we're concerned about. Anybody have any comments they can contribute here?
Well, one of the things that we found, our state did a big seminar on cybersecurity, and one of the speakers there talked about the fact that the health information has become a bigger market for theft than the credit information. That people don't want credit cards; they want people's health insurance to be able to buy their to use instead. And so counties, that's a big area with counties. You know, we all have health departments. Lots of us have nursing homes and things like that we have health information. And the one department that we find has a huge amount of data that they've never even thought about, and many times the IT people aren't even working with, is the corrections, the jails. They have the health information, they have credit cards for them to buy things in the commissary and things, and I mean, the IT department isn't even looking over their shoulder to watch those guys. So it's a big area that we found that we're really trying to put some.
And I would have never thought of that either. The prisoners, you're saying that they have. I guess they have rights too, right?
Yeah.
Can you summarize his question for us so we can?
Sure. He was saying how that the biggest area that he's heard that hacking lately, or the targets that they have that they're not looking after, is the medical records, right? And they have a big population with the medical records and the prisoners and inmates, and I guess other probably special categories of customers that you keep records of for some reason. But that protecting against those medical records is something that they haven't really traditionally focused on. So most of these types of networks, you're probably not going to be too much involved with, except for cloud. Let's talk about cloud. How many of you use cloud resources? Yeah. What do you use?
Dropbox, Box.
Email?
Yeah.
Email apps? Okay.
Well, they're more data storage apps. Like,
So file transfer?
right.
Okay. What else? What other kind of services do we use on the cloud? Anybody else want? Training systems? So like an LMS system? Okay.
I think a lot of our utility departments within our municipalities use industrial control systems to operate, water and sewer systems, power delivery systems. I think those are a lot of overlooked networks.
Yeah, and a lot of the utility networks and infrastructure traditionally have followed the isolation pattern that they have a private network. But definitely an evolving area, because they're getting interconnected by somebody's desktop computer happens to connect two networks together, and now the whole critical infrastructure network's connected to the internet. Had that happen a lot, and that's a lot been the focus of some regulation in the last 5 years or so from FERC and DOE about how do we disconnect and make sure that we're not inadvertently connected to the world on our critical infrastructure networks.
Since cloud computing is such a general term, how would you define that? You got a lot of enterprises that are doing client-server type setups, if you will. You talked about SaaS earlier, software as a service. How would you go about defining cloud?
Cloud computing, wow. I think about it in terms of cybersecurity, and it's like the Wild West. There's really no way to even know where your stuff is on the cloud in a lot of areas. The definition of cloud computing is that resources, meaning computers, hard drives, processing, memory, is allocated at runtime. So you go out to the cloud, or your software that you're using goes out to the cloud and says, I need to store information. Where can I store it? And 10 servers pop their hand up, and you store it wherever, and you map where you stored it. So prior to that allocation of information, allocation of resources, nobody knows where they're going to go. It's all done on the spontaneous, in the moment. So in terms of security, you have to implement all your security before it goes out there. So that's the biggest part as far as when you're talking to any cloud provider. Software as a service, where you have somebody that, like an LMS system is a software as a service. You're paying for a service and they're running the software. They operate all the transactions and show you interface to something. So you put information in, they do all the operations and show you something. So they're doing the software service, they're doing the app or the operations on it, they're doing the storage of it, they're doing the security, hopefully, right? And then you have platform as a service where people are actually, where you might not have an IT section or department in your company. So you hire out to have those systems done remotely. And different types of, anybody else use any different types of cloud services, categories?
All of these are on the cloud?
Memory, so data storage as a service? Dropbox? That falls under the application as a service or software as a service for the most part. Web hosting? Yeah, that's, once again, that's either infrastructure as a service or software as a service, depending on how you look at it. But infrastructure as a service might be where they connect part of their network to your corporate infrastructure and you use their actually physical networks and lease it from them. A lot of people working remote offices and people that aren't physically in the same building will use infrastructure as a service, or companies will use that type of thing.
So here's my follow-up question. So
Sure.
if enterprises have put in place a hosted solution, cloud-based, and if you have a breach, who's ultimately liable if the breach occurred in a cloud-based platform or environment?
Who owns the data? You?
Yeah, we would.
Have you signed, and this is, like I said, where it's the Wild West still right now. Have you looked at a contract with that provider and says, okay, who owns the data? Should there be a breach? Who's responsible for it? Is it written in, is it in writing?
Yeah.
And says they're responsible for the breach? And what are they responsible to pay for? So how much per instance, and how do you, define what they're paying for? Is that contractually defined? It is?
Yes.
So they're responsible for the breach, but if it's your data out there in the wind, whose perception and reputation loss has occurred? What is the value of that? Is that in your contract? It says, hey, if I lose this much data, the perception to my business is worth this much to me. This is another insurance risk question. So all these are very undefined. Like I said, I look at the cloud as a Wild West right now, and you'll see probably in the next couple of years, I mean, if you look at Google and search engines in general, people have learned how to get themselves at the top by faking out Google's algorithms or whatever search engine's algorithm. This engine of dynamically allocating resources is rather new. People are going to find ways around it, find ways to use it to their benefit, use it to get information stored in areas where they can just sit and work on it all day. We will talk about this a little more in later topics, but all good questions. And as far as I've done a lot of work with the crossing of trust to virtuality, which basically means what's real and what's not, and how does the real trust the virtual or know that it's virtual or another real machine. And those questions are so loosely defined in cloud computing that there, by definition, is no way to know. Let me, there's a couple of things here that we'll talk about for concepts. Packets and routing. Is anybody, whenever you're communicating on the internet, That information, not only does it go across 10 computers, like we saw the Google example, where I'm going through 13 computers to get from my house to Google. Every file, every information you send is broken up into little chunks. And those chunks are put together like this, where there's a little bit at the beginning, a header and a footer that tells them what's in between, and then a certain size payload in there, and millions of these are sent for every file. The thing is, they don't have to go on the same path. They don't have to go on the same computer. On the internet, they can alternate like cars on a busy highway. So that alternating like cars is this dynamic transport approach. Okay? Very valuable. Now we can have an internet of devices out there. We don't care how many hops, how many network computers you go across to get to where you're going, and how many you're communicating with. You can find out and you can look at it and kind of get a good laugh of, wow, I went all the way to Boston to get to LA. That's interesting. But then there are other networks who do structured transport. And the critical infrastructure is a lot of these structured transport type networks where they have to be time sensitive. And some of your banking ATM networks and the more long-standing high security networks will have these structured transports as well. So from point to point, your information is following the same path versus getting mingled everywhere. These two types of concepts will come into play later on as we talk about some security features when we're crossing these two. Also some platforms, point to point, the old phone service, or if you use a dial-up to connect computer across a dial-up network, you're actually connecting directly to the other end. The in-between doesn't, it's a structured transport that goes directly to the other end. It's not a dynamic transport. That being said, there's a little bit more involved with that. Now, telephone companies are running voice over dynamic networks when they get fast enough. But for the most part, the earlier adoption of telephone networks were direct point-to-point. So as far as security, you start looking at if you're on a direct connection, like a telephone, you have a little bit more leeway. You can, it's easier to trust that connection. Different broadcast. So this next section is really the key things you need to take from cybersecurity. So I want to make sure that we understand that even though this might not relate directly to things that you're looking for risk management, for cybersecurity, this understanding these concepts is basically the base of what you'll need for everything else. And that's why it's important to kind of to go through them. And but we'll start with the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's six of these. But we're going to talk about identifying data, hiding data in plain sight, verifying the people, the machines that make changes to your data, safe data storage and transmission, and tracking and verification. Now, a lot of these, you can see that they correlate to the PAIN acronym we talked about, the 4 main features of what security is doing. But this is how, now that we've learned about the data and how computers look at data and the cybersecurity actions, and we're going to start crossing things we know in the real world to how it's done in the cyber world with these simple transactions. Now, these are going to seem much more complicated if you hear them, somebody technical talking about them. So this is a very high level, what some of those things are doing, but for the most part, cybersecurity, only every transaction you hear of with all the fancy terms and acronyms are doing these 6 things. in different combinations. So identifying data, people are identified by a thumbprint, or uniquely. That's one way they can be identified. Biometrics, your eye, your retina. You see this used in security to identify a person. So can data have a fingerprint? Is the first thing we need to find out is, can we identify a piece of data? Is that possible? So we went back to the data, understanding that data portion. All data is made up of numbers. So since they're made of numbers, you can do a mathematical operation on them. We kind of talked about that earlier. They're formatted into patterns, but they're still numbers. So now if I have a mathematical equation, and I can take a piece of information and run it through, doesn't matter what the contents are because they're all just numbers. And I get an output of that piece of data that's always the same. Kind of like your thumbprint, it's always the same, but every person has one different. So we're doing the same thing here now with data using what's called a hash algorithm. If you'll hear that word is associated with many different security operations and security softwares. But they're taking a math equation, putting a piece of information through it, and acts like a number crunching machine. And you get out a set length of information. So every file you put into a hash algorithm gets the same length of information out. So it's the same size, round, shaped like a thumb. It's a fingerprint. But they're all different. So any particular piece of data will have the same fingerprint, but every piece of data will have it different. You change one bit of the data that you put into this type of equation, and the entire fingerprint is different. So this gives you the ability now to create an identity for data and then verify that later on. So if you've created an identity of data, then you transmit it to New York and you send the identity with it. They can take that same piece of data, run it through the same equation, and should get that same identity. So now you've verified that integrity from point to point. We'll talk about integrity as one of the later ones. But that data fingerprint is going to look just like a list of hexadecimal numbers. So any piece of data has now a hexadecimal number output, and it's math equation in, math number out. That is how we identify data. And we use hash algorithms. You'll see these terms, SHAs, SHA-256, SHA-1. Don't be too concerned with them other than it's the number, the size of the output of data that they get. The size of the fingerprint. Is it a fingerprint this big or is it one this big? So now the second topic is hiding data in plain sight. Now a lot of people are interested in this one because you'll hear it as encryption. You know, what is encryption? And a lot of people associate that encryption and security are the same thing. But encryption is just a property of data. That's the best way to describe it. It's like if your font is blue or underlined or bold, it has a property. If your file is encrypted or your data is encrypted or not is a property. The security is actually in the process of getting it from plain to encrypted and back. So for this, we use a different mathematic algorithm. Same type of thing, data in, data out, all data is numbers. The big things to know about this is there's a key portion. I will talk about this key throughout security. This key portion is the most important part of cybersecurity. Understanding how these keys are used, stored, protected, is the downfall of 90% of cybersecurity attacks. But an encryption algorithm has the algorithm which everybody knows. They're all standards. And then a key that makes it unique for your use. And you just input a file, use the key to encrypt it, and at the output you get this encrypted text that looks just like, example, here's Apple Computer. Remember we talked about hexadecimal? This is what it looks like in ASCII hexadecimal for Apple Computer. The computer is just a number. Now if I take and encrypt it, it might look like this. To the computer, it's just a number. But to you, you can't read it. Your software doesn't recognize it. So it is a property of this data now that is encrypted with that key. So now, more on hiding data in plain sight. There's two functionalities that are happening to accomplish this in all of your operations. So encryption has two different types, and they are used together everywhere. But yet, understanding the two and what their strengths are will help you understand what all these applications are doing and why. Is this my same? Hold on, I think I had the same file in there twice. The first one is called symmetric encryption. And it encrypts data using a read-write key. The same key for reading it and writing it. So you take plain text, you put the key in, you write it to encrypted. You put the same key back in, put the encrypted text in, and it makes it plain text. This is a very simple mathematically. Your computers do it very quickly. And when you're doing stream encryption, that means communications from one point to another, and you want to encrypt a lot of information and send everything encrypted, you use this type of encryption. So the problems, there's a challenge to this, is now if I send something over there to Phil and I encrypt it, I have a key, I have to give him that key so he can decrypt it. Okay? So the problem is now sharing this key. If I got to send this key to New York, somebody can decrypt it. How do I get it there without just transmitting it and anybody can grab it? This is where a lot of cybersecurity transmission is broken, because they grab the key in transit. Remember I told you this key is the most important part of cybersecurity, how it's handled and how it's managed. So if you can't get them that key to everybody you want to have it, and here's the next part. Do you trust Phil to have it and not to give it to his friend or publish it or write it down somewhere? It's kind of like a shared password. You have to think about it that way. So now there's a solution for the key exchange problem that another smart guy, mathematic whiz, came up with. Let's exchange information securely so that we don't have to exchange keys. How do we then exchange a piece of information? And what this is called is asymmetric encryption. And what it does is you encrypt data with a write key. So you have two keys, and you'll hear this often, key pairs. You'll hear it in terms of certificates, PKI, private key infrastructure, or public key infrastructure you'll hear talked about a lot. And they always say, oh, there's a key pair, a private and a public key. So what the private and public keys are doing is one writes, makes the information encrypted, and it requires the other one to decrypt it. So now the read key takes the encrypted information and turns it back to plain text. So now once again, handling and managing these keys is the primary function of the cybersecurity and the digital security. So when you're encrypting information to send it, you take and you put that private write key. No, wait, hold on. You put your read key somewhere safe, okay? You want somebody to send you information. You're the only one that can read it now. So you send out now that write key and you give it to everybody. So now anybody can encrypt information and send it to you, but you're the only one that can read it. So now your web browser, when you do an SSL or web browser security, on both ends it's doing this. Both people are giving out their write key. Give you mine, you give me yours. We write information and send it to each other, and then we use that as a session to start communicating. So we've effectively transferred information without exposing our keys. The downside, asymmetric algorithms, you think, wow, I just use this all the time. So no, but I'm the only one that can read information, they can read information. We'll be good. Well, we just use this for all security. Unfortunately, there's a downside to it. The mathematical equation for this type of transaction is very long and intensive. We're talking if you do one, it might take a couple seconds. And that's doing information that would be just really short, like a password, or a key like we saw in the symmetric. So basically what they do is they use the asymmetric to transfer keys and then use symmetric to do the stream encryption. And that's how those two combine together that work in your web browser on both ends, exchange, set up a session, and then communicate with encryption. So now we'll go back to my example of I have to give Phil my key so that I can encrypt something and he can decrypt it, right? So now I give him my write key for my asymmetric. He just makes up a random piece of information, sends it to me, I can decrypt it. He gives me his write key, I make up a piece of random information, I send it to him, he decrypts it. We both take what I made and what he made and put it together. And we'll talk about this in the next couple slides, a little more detailed. Now the next portion of, we talked about using an asymmetric algorithm. Creating a unique signature is a big primitive, one of the main things you want to do with cybersecurity. So how do you create a unique signature? Oops. First of all, we start out with the first thing we talked about, making a fingerprint of data. So whatever piece of data you want to sign to make a digital signature of, you have to create its unique fingerprint. So if I wanted to sign something at a notary, what do? I sign my name, they verify me, and then they stamp it. So in the digital world, it's the same type of thing. You create a fingerprint of the data, and then you stamp it. So now that you've created a fingerprint, you then use that asymmetric algorithm to stamp it. And you create a certificate, which is basically a unique signature. But remember, we're using this asymmetric algorithm. The keys are managed a little bit differently. In fact, you take your write key, the thing that you use to encrypt it, and that's what you hide. So now nobody else can encrypt it. Nobody else can create that same unique signature that you did. So this key is what, when we talked about business models and how a company like VeriSign stamps and signs things, This is what they do. So their whole business model is based around that key staying in memory in safe storage, but yet them being able to do this transaction. So they have to protect it every time they take it out and use it, and then put it back away. And their whole business model is based around that, along with a lot of software companies that make a key for using their software. They have to make a way to sign it and then protect that. So now you take just the opposite, that read key, and you give it to everybody. In fact, it's in the certificate. It's part of the certificate, the read key. So when you get a piece of software and it has a certificate, or somebody has an email certificate that you want to trust them, the key to read their certificate is in it. It's the read public key. But you can't write their signature because they have that stored away in their private memory. So now once again we come back to the management of these keys is really what cybersecurity is about. So anybody can read it to decrypt it. So what have you produced? Something that only you can make and nobody else can make. And that's a unique signature is. And these are used throughout cybersecurity. Business transactions that want to have proof of non-repudiation. This is how it's done. So somebody can do an operation and you prove that they did it. So the next area, we all know or heard of passwords, authentication, is the next kind of cryptographic primitive that's important to understand the features of. We know that as authentication. So verifying someone that you know or something you have, a password or a key. There has to be a person involved at some point to start this process. I'm trying to go at a level to catch what you guys are going to need to know without getting too in depth here, I'm sorry. As far as the processes where your company needs to be aware of where vulnerabilities happen in this process, where the risk is, it's the initial when somebody's involved. Once you get a password, you log in all the time, right? You log in, you might use it for a year. Who initially gave you that password? This is where the most risk in business is the initial setup. People and security operations don't look at hacking a password or trying to break a password. They find the process that your password was given out in the first place. So who has access to giving out a password? Who has access to creating one? The first thing, if a hacker gets into a computer, the first thing he does is makes himself his own password and his own account. Because people or businesses in general don't go look at the process. Once there's an account, they think it's good. So verifying that those passwords are made by the people that were supposed to make them, the human in the loop, both when they first do it and then on a reoccurring basis, is important, and that's the big risk factors in the authentication process. What did I do here? Sure.
So an example of that would be, I guess, maybe would be when you sign online banking, that you're signed on something different than you normally sign on and asking for additional security just because it's want to verify that you're actually.
I'm not sure if I caught your question.
This is like an example. I sign on online banking, and if I'm not signed in on a network where I'm normally signed on at, it asks me additional security measures to check and make sure that is that part of that.
That's what's considered multi-factor authentication, and it's basically checking to see is this outside of your normal patterns, and that's kind of additional and above this, where you're starting to look at how do I continuously verify the person once I authenticate them. But yes, that is to combat the problem where people get passwords and get access by using a system that generates them where a person's supposed to be involved, and how did they get it? So, how did they get the password initially? How did they get access to the system? So the biggest, like I said again, the biggest risks for people authenticating and have access isn't the process of authenticating, it's the process of gaining a password in the first place. That's kind of what this next one is. Once the initial trust is set up, then there's many different ways of testing it on a reoccurring basis. Machine. Kind of a more in-depth topic on the theory of trust. Once you, I'm trying to minimize this for you guys. You don't trust a computer. There's a computer doesn't have any accountability, responsibility for your data. You trust a computer because the person is linked to it that sits behind it. So transferring that level of trust you have for the actions done by the computer has to do with how you relate the trust for the person to the computer and how you maintain that over time. So, and that's kind of what he was saying is, his question was asking, you know, when there's additional security measures and additional things required for you if you're not on your home network, they're establishing trust for you over time because they say, well, we might not trust the computer if he's not at it or has it been stolen. So those risk factors involved with relating the trust of the computer to the person sitting at it. Go ahead, Phil.
I was going to ask, a lot of computers today have a program where you can ask the computer to save your username and password on the computer, or require you to enter it each time to go to a particular place. I mean, is that what we're talking about here? When you do that, you're transferring your trust to a computer as opposed to whoever's happens to be logging in. In other words, if your computer is saving all these passwords and automatically enters them, if someone else sits there, they can get access to everything. Is that what you mean?
Yes, that's basically the problem, is that people transfer that trust and give it to the computer by giving the computer a password to store. And that's why the trust, the reoccurrence and trust is basically authenticating over time. So you authenticate to a computer, the computer then links that person to its computer, to the trust. But who's to say 5 minutes from now you still trust that person, or you still believe that person is authenticated? That is what trust does, is it sets up a reoccurring authentication over time and maintains what level do you have trust for it by saying, oh wait, should I still trust you? And having a second question like that, or you're on something that's not provided, you're on a different network, how do I trust it? How do I verify over time that I still trust you? And it's a...
Take another example. For example, when I log on to State Street to look at our company's account for our investment, and after a certain amount of time, it will log off if there's been no activity for 10 minutes or whatever. Is
that's also setting up trust. So over time, it's saying if you haven't provided input from the user on a continued basis for this long, we're going to say we don't trust you anymore, and you have to re-authenticate.
That's something State Street's doing. And State Street is worried that I may get up from my seat and somebody else may be sitting there. So after 10 minutes, they just log it off.
And that's protecting the company that has the data, or the company that's managing your data, because they're basically out there saying, I got to continuously think about, do I trust that person? Even though I've authenticated them once, do I continue to keep them authenticated over time, is whether I trust them or not. it's something, it's almost conceptual now, because these two examples are great as to what companies are starting to do. But in the past, once you authenticated, it just kept you logged on. I know people that would log on to a system and 2 days later they wouldn't shut their computer down because they had to go back and log on again. The trust is actually something that's being added to the security model to say, you know, you authenticate, but I don't trust you 5 minutes later. Or I need to verify I can trust you 5 minutes later. And it's a concept of extending authentication past the initial authentication point to a time-based authentication. But thanks, that helped me explain it, these two examples. So thank both of you. So here's a big thing when you're looking at the risk that companies have in storing their passwords. A company should never store a password in plain text. If you're logging onto a banking site, that site should not have the text you type in stored in their database. If you can call in, and I have this sometimes, I called into a call center for a company that I use, and they said, oh, do you have your password? I can read it back to you. I was like, what? They have my password stored in their database, and they could read it to me. They should never have that. Risk number one, every system that authenticates should only store the hash, the fingerprint of the authentication. Should never have the plain text password stored. This is a big place where companies fall short, and applications in general didn't think about this until years later after they started putting them together. And I think even Windows in 2000, when Active Directory first came out, had an option for plain text password. So you could go through the list and everybody's password was in there that you had selected the option for plain text. But anybody you go into, this should be a check that says, hey, if you have access or employee has access to a plain text password, then that is a high risk. And it's not just one high risk, it's a high risk for anybody that has access to the system now has access to everybody's password. If there's one thing in security that I would say this needs to be taken from as far as passwords and authentication, is that plain text password does not need to and should never be stored by a corporate entity. But to authenticate somebody, they put in their password, it runs it through that hashing algorithm, creates a fingerprint, and compares it against the fingerprint stored in memory. Now you've authenticated somebody without actually storing their password.
So if you have a vendor that has a thing on their website that says, if you forgot your password, click here and they'll mail it back to you, that means you're storing the plain text?
If they're mailing it back to you, they should have a reset function. Absolutely. If they're mailing it back to you, they have it. If they say you have to reset it, that means they don't. That's a good kind of test right there. Yeah. But the difference between a password, storing a password and storing a hash, is really displayed here. The hash, the fingerprint. If you stored a list of fingerprints of everybody's password, the challenge to break a 128-bit fingerprint, roughly the 128 bits is about the number of atoms in the sun. So a computer to go through that many calculations to try and break one hash versus breaking, Mad Dog as somebody's password is a lot different. And that's why the strength here for anybody that has them, not only the availability of the employees to have access to them, or to anybody that gets in the system have all the passwords, but the actual trying to break them one at a time becomes very difficult.
I got a question. How often are they using some sort of a program to try and break into versus just using common passwords? And he's changing his from Mad Dog when he gets home tonight. So.
And that's like on the top 20 list, that Mad Dog or whatever. But you can actually go online and do a search on Google for the top most broken passwords. And you'll be like, oh crap, I had to change that. But it's because people think alike. You ever hear, there's a term called the birthday paradox, which we have, what, 40-some people in this room. How many people think that there's two people in this room that would have the exact same birthday? So raise your hand if you think I could find two people in this room that have the same birthday. Okay. So the rest of you think that, you know, in this population, the chances are I can't find somebody with the same birthday. The birthday paradox says if you have more than 30 people in a room, better than 50% odds that two people have the same birthday. So let's try this. Anybody want to try a theory to practice? Just the day and the month. And somebody tell me if they have the same birthday. We'll go through.
10/31.
10/31?
1031. Wow.
Well, and usually you have to go further than that, but and the problem with human behavior is people use identifiable records and information for their passwords. So if you went through those files that go through passwords, they go through all the dates on the calendar. It takes them 15 nanoseconds, and they check all those hashes against your password hash. And yeah, actually they do. They attempt things that are recognizable to people and trends and patterns. And then, you know, all those with adding 1, 2, 3 after it, and, you know, a number before, a number after. But yeah. So yeah, just another example. 256 bits is about the number of atoms in our known universe. So if you have to go through all those possible combinations, the point here is people don't, attackers, hackers, whatever, don't try to break algorithms. It's too difficult. They try and break the human patterns and the human trends and where people store things and how people transition and how people send things back and forth is what cybersecurity attacks break. The next thing, safe transmission, safe data storage and transmission. This one is usually of interest to most people because it is that encryption piece that everybody says, wow, security equals encryption. But data pushed off somewhere to another time, saved, or it's transferred in time, how do you transfer it safely? Cybersecurity has to answer the question of what happened between two different times or two locations with that data. Did someone see it that was not allowed to? Is a question. Did an error occur that changed something in it so the data is different because of an error? Did someone change it? Did someone intercept it and alter the content if it was in transmission that it gave them some benefit to change it and send it on? Did the intended recipient get the data, or did it come from the intended person you think it's coming from? If you're over a virtual environment, are you sure of that, and how can you be? So storing and transmitting data safely uses combinations of the primitives we've already talked about, a little bit like the last one did. Encryption, the scrambling of the information, and the setting up the key exchange, so the asymmetric. And then the encryption process uses the symmetric. And then it uses verifying integrity. So it uses the data signatures or data thumbprint to verify integrity. And we'll talk about protecting that most sensitive information. Go back to the keys a little bit here. But data integrity monitoring, this is something, a risk to be aware of. If data is sitting in a database on any system, companies have to understand how the data has changed or if it has changed. And monitoring that in real time can give some insight. So there's programs out there that say, I'm going to monitor this data, and if it changes, I flag something, or I tell something. I tell somebody. So you can look at, and then part of that is that the change flag then says who's in it right now. Are they authenticated? Where are they from? Where's their connection? And a lot of times it's just logging it and understanding the change, or saving the old information and the new. These are all security solutions that fall under integrity monitoring, verifying in real time what's changing in data. And passive can use fingerprints. So if you use a fingerprint of the data before you save it and then afterwards, that's kind of looking at it passively. Or the active can use looking at who's logged in and what they're actively doing. But this data integrity monitoring is a big piece. It's kind of evolving as what do I, especially in information security, how do I protect information's integrity while it's sitting there? Because the data is a moving train. People are into it all the time. So I have to have a way of monitoring what's changing, what's allowed to change, and what's not, and who's doing the changes. But safe storage and transmission, we talked about this a little bit when I started talking about asymmetric and symmetric algorithms. But if you have two people sitting at two computers across the internet or across any network, at both ends, they take that asymmetric write key and send it to the other end. Each end generates a random some piece of data. Key, we'll call it a key, but right now it's just a random number. Then they use that write key to encrypt that random number, and they send it, the encrypted number, to the other side. So now each side takes that random number they got from the other side. They use their private read key that they've stored in their safe to decrypt it. And they get the random number in plain text from the other side that was encrypted. And they take that random number plus the one they made, put them together, and now you have an encryption key. So you now, both sides are doing this same operation. They've exchanged, without having any compromise, a method of encrypting between 2 points and sending information securely. Sure.
Has the industry already moved to this approach, or are folks using the...
This is what SSL and TSL does. So this is what your applications are already doing. What I'm explaining to you is to understand these primitives that are happening, because you have to implement these in the real world as well, and in separate places when you do vendor interaction and software as a service and internet. At least understanding what is happening in those operations. This is absolutely happening every time you click on a banking site. This whole process is happening. So then once they've exchanged those two pieces of information, put them together on both sides, they use that as a key on both sides. Like I talked about if Phil and I exchanged a key earlier, how do we get that to each other? Now we've just exchanged it over the same wire. We can encrypt over without compromising any of it. So now that data can go through this encryption algorithm, encrypt it, go across the wire encrypted, come back to this end and we decrypt it and have it in plain text again. So this is setting up a safe communication and then transferring information by encrypting it. So now add to that, how do we verify the integrity of it? If we take a piece of data and we produce a fingerprint, we talked about earlier producing a fingerprint with a hash algorithm, and then we sign that fingerprint, we create a signature of that fingerprint. And along with the data, we send the signature. So nobody else can create that signature now. We're the only ones that can create that signature. We send it along with the data. So data and signature go everywhere together. This is also something that happens commonly everywhere. If you download software, you get a certificate. You communicate with a website, you get a certificate. They're sending you their signed certificate that says I'm authentic, along with the data that it's authenticating. So then now I receive it, I want to verify that who's authenticated it, or who's made the signature. I want to verify that signature. I take that piece of data, I produce its fingerprint, I take the key out of the certificate, and I decrypt the fingerprint. If they match, then I know that that person who created that signature, that piece of data is exactly the same. So the integrity of it has not changed. It is still the same piece of data that that person created a signature of. This is a more difficult one, but it's used everywhere. So everybody kind of, if you have any questions on this, I'll go through it again. But the signature that goes along with the data item and then proving that signature is a process used everywhere in cybersecurity. Any questions on this one? Match proves integrity, we already said that. So what are the most sensitive material? We talked about this before. What is every cybersecurity operation that we looked at, which is all the primitives, everything that's done in cybersecurity, what we looked at, what is it based on? The storage and the handling of those keys. They're relatively small pieces of data, which becomes problematic. They, like any good password, has random, long, lots of diversity. A key is very diverse in its bit arrangement because it's actually looked at in binary, so the hexadecimal is just random looking to us. But the more diverse it is, the better, the stronger it is, just like a strong password. But this makes them, is actually problematic. It makes a problem. Because look at what I have circled in, or boxed in red. These are what a hard drive looks like. Remember we talked about data is patterned and put between headers and footers, so you understand what's in between. Keys become the only thing that doesn't have a pattern on your hard drive, in your memory. So not only are they small, they're the most sensitive information, they're different than everything else. So we'll refer to this quite often as, along with how you implement the cybersecurity primitives, the storage and handling of these sensitive pieces of information are very key. And applications usually won't tell you how this is done. Some of the longest standing applications out there have been storing keys in memory that is extractable for years. We talked about different file patterns, and the focus on a strong security is the process which protects the keys. So now tracking and verifying actions. This is a big one that we'll also talk about. It's an extension of the signature and the verification of signature. Signing a computer transaction, because everything done on a computer is a hexadecimal number. We can sign anything now. So any combination of actions becomes a transaction. We can sign it and make a digital signature of it. So we can use the current user signed in, information about the action they did, the time that the action took place, put them together in a document, make a fingerprint, make a signature, and send that signature with the transaction. And you could do these all day long. make every transaction. Remember we said transaction integrity was key in banking operations? Every operation that they do has a little code at the end, and it's universally understood by every bank. So if you read a transaction code from your transaction of transferring money from one account to another, they can take that transaction and find it anywhere else in the banking system because it's open for them all to look at. They don't care about who sees it, but they care about making sure that that transaction is followed and can't be recreated by someone else or changed. So this, links people, systems, actions, and times they took place together. And this is done across the business world. All these things that we'll talk about in how you manage, how you find risk, has to do with whether you can prove what happened and keeping track of it. So anything that is on a computer, once again, now we can make a transaction out of because it's all just mathematical equations and numbers. So, and as long as that person who made the signature keeps that private key, that right key to themselves, the signature is protected. So now the compromise of that becomes what hacks are looking for to prove or be able to spoof a transaction. But the actions are non-reputable, which was one of the N in the PAIN acronym. And this is how non-repudiation is done. Credit card transactions, banking transfers, talk about some of these. Updates to confidential material. Every time, if you're looking at data integrity on a database, every time data is changed, they make a transaction signature for it. On top of that, storing log files of the transactions. So now you can see that these transactions can actually become a bigger storage item and data item out there than the actual data itself. If 100 people change a file every day, the file is only a megabyte, and they change it 100 times every day for 6 months, the transaction log on that file could be bigger than the file itself. So the dilemma here is always, how do you watch the watchers, the people who have access to make signatures, the people who are in control of the log files, people who can have valid access. But as far as tracking and verifying actions, I always put that as the last thing, because no matter how well you make these systems to do the mathematical equation, to track the people, to log what they're doing, there's always someone that has access to that, right? That whole process.